It was a cold Christmas Eve in the small town of Ravenwood. The snow was falling heavily, covering the streets in a blanket of white. The scent of pine trees and gingerbread filled the air, and families were gathered around their warm homes, preparing for the holiday. Maggie sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft hum of Christmas music playing in the background. Her parents were upstairs, getting ready for their family's Christmas Eve dinner, and her younger brother, Tommy, was fast asleep upstairs. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, a soft knock echoed at the door. Maggie stood up, puzzled. It was well past midnight, and no one came to visit at this hour, especially not on Christmas Eve. She opened the door to find a man standing on the doorstep. His clothes were soaked from the snow, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling part, black, as if they had no whites, just an endless void. "I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve," the man said, his voice raspy. "I've lost my way. Can I come inside to warm up for just a few minutes?" Maggie hesitated but stepped aside, her instincts telling her something was off. The man walked inside without waiting for her reply, and she closed the door quickly behind him. "Thank you," the man whispered as he stepped toward the fireplace. Maggie's heart began to race, but she couldn't bring herself to ask him to leave. He sat down on the couch, staring into the fire. After a few moments, Maggie spoke up, her voice trembling. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The man turned his head slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Suddenly, the lights flickered and a cold wind blew through the house. Maggie gasped as the temperature seemed to drop drastically. The man stood up and faced her. "I'm sorry for disturbing your holiday," he said, his voice no longer raspy but smooth, almost melodic. "But I've come for something you have." Before Maggie could ask what he meant, the man's eyes glowed bright red, and the room was filled with a high-pitched ringing. The walls seemed to stretch, the house warping around her. She tried to move, but her feet were glued to the floor. What do you want?" Maggie stammered, her voice breaking. The man smiled again, his teeth now razor-sharp. "I only want one thing," he said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small, old-fashioned Christmas ornament, a glass ball with a flickering candle inside. Maggie's eyes widened. It was her grandmother's ornament, the one her family had kept for generations. "I've waited a long time for this," the man whispered. With a flick of his wrist, the ornament shattered in his hand, sending shards of glass flying through the room. The man vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but an eerie silence and the smell of burnt pine. The temperature slowly returned to normal, but Maggie was left standing, frozen in fear. She looked at the broken pieces of glass scattered across the floor and realized her grandmother's ornament was gone, along with the stranger. Her family found her hours later, curled up by the fireplace, clutching the remains of the broken ornament. The story of the Christmas Eve stranger would be passed down for generations, a chilling reminder that some visitors come on Christmas Eve to claim more than just warmth. They come for your soul. Story 2. Every year, Clara decorated her home for Christmas with great care. The lights, the ornaments, the stockings by the fireplace. It was a tradition she had kept for as long as she could remember. But this year, something was different. As she put up the final touches on the tree, Clara noticed a strange presence in the room. It wasn't a cold breeze or a draft. There was a palpable heaviness in the air, something that made her skin crawl. That night, as Clara was about to go to bed, she heard a faint whisper from the living room. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the whisper came again. It was soft, melodic, and filled with sorrow. Clara hesitated, then walked toward the living room. The lights on the tree blinked erratically as she entered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And there, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair long and unkempt. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow, voids of pure blackness that seemed to reach into Clara's very soul. The woman didn't move, but Clara could feel her presence more than ever. The air grew colder as the woman's whispering continued. "Help me," she moaned, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the tree's branches. Clara tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She reached out, as if drawn to the woman, but before her hand could touch the figure, the woman's eyes locked onto hers. The room seemed to blur, and Clara felt herself falling, spiraling into darkness. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, Clara awoke, gasping for air. She was in her bed, the sun streaming through the curtains. Had it been a dream? She rushed to the living room to check, but everything was as it should be. The tree stood, beautifully decorated, the stockings hung by the fire. Yet, as she passed the corner where she had seen the woman, Clara noticed something strange. A single, old-fashioned ornament was now hanging on the tree. It was a glass ornament, twisted and cracked, with a strange figure inside, and it was glowing faintly, as if powered by some unseen force. Clara backed away slowly, realizing that some spirits come not to haunt, but to be remembered. This Christmas, she would learn that the true spirit of Christmas isn't just about celebration, it's about the souls who linger, waiting to be acknowledged. Story 3. It was Christmas Eve in a small town called Ravenwood. The snow was falling, and the streets were covered with white snow. Inside, people were getting ready for Christmas, cooking, and enjoying the holiday. Maggie was sitting by the fireplace in her house. The warm fire was glowing, and soft Christmas music played in the background. Her parents were upstairs, and her younger brother, Tommy, was asleep. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Maggie stood up, confused. It was very late, and no one came at this hour. When Maggie opened the door, she saw a man standing on the porch. He was wet from the snow, and his face looked pale. His eyes were completely black, with no white at all. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said. "I've lost my way. Can I come inside to warm up?" Maggie didn't know why, but she stepped back and let him in. The man walked straight to the fireplace and sat down without saying another word. Maggie felt strange, but didn't ask him to leave. After a while, she asked, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The man turned to her and smiled. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The lights in the house suddenly flickered, and the room got colder. Maggie felt scared. The man stood up, his eyes glowing red. He said, "I've come for something you have." Before Maggie could ask, the man held up a small Christmas ornament, a family heirloom that had been passed down for years. "I've waited a long time for this," he said. The ornament shattered in his hand, and the man disappeared. The room was silent again, and the fire was calm. The next morning, Maggie's family found her sitting in front of the fireplace, holding broken pieces of the ornament. The man was gone, and so was the ornament. No one would ever know who he really was, but the legend of the Christmas Eve stranger lived on. Story 4 ______________________________________________________________________________________________________________________ Clara loved decorating for Christmas. Every year, she hung up lights, placed ornaments on the tree, and made everything look perfect. But this year, something felt different. As Clara finished decorating the tree, she felt like something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like someone was watching her. That night, she heard a soft whisper. It was faint at first, but it seemed to call her name. Clara was scared but decided to check. When she walked into the living room, she saw a woman standing by the tree. The woman was dressed in an old gown, and her face was pale. Her eyes were black, and they stared at Clara. The woman whispered, "Help me." Clara felt cold, and her heart started racing. She asked, "Who are you?" But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she just kept whispering. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and the woman vanished. Clara blinked and found herself back in her bed. Was it a dream? The next morning, she went to the living room, and everything seemed normal. The tree was still decorated, and the house was quiet. But on the tree, Clara noticed a strange ornament, an old, cracked glass ball with a tiny figure inside. It was glowing softly. Clara stepped back, realizing that some spirits don't want to scare you. They just want to be remembered. Story 5. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Ravenwood. The streets were covered with snow, and the whole town was quiet, except for the sound of snow falling softly. People were inside their warm homes, decorating trees and preparing for Christmas dinner. Maggie was sitting by the fireplace in her living room. The fire crackled softly, and she watched the flames dance. Her parents were upstairs, getting ready for the Christmas dinner, and her younger brother, Tommy, was asleep in his room. The house smelled of pine from the Christmas tree and cinnamon from the cookies in the oven. As Maggie sat there, feeling the warmth of the fire, she suddenly heard a soft knock on the door. She stood up, confused. It was late, and no one ever came this late, especially not on Christmas Eve. She slowly walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a man. His clothes were soaked from the snow, and he looked very cold. His face was pale, almost like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. But it was his eyes that really made Maggie feel uneasy. His eyes were completely black, with no white part at all. The man smiled at her, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft and raspy. "I've lost my way, and I'm very cold. May I come inside to warm up for a little while?" Maggie hesitated. She had always been taught not to let strangers into the house, especially late at night. But something about the man made her feel like she should help him. She stepped aside and let him in. The man didn't say anything else, just walked straight to the fireplace and sat down. His eyes didn't leave the flames. Maggie closed the door quickly, feeling uneasy but not knowing why. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Maggie finally asked, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The man turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, Maggie felt like he was staring right through her. He smiled again, but this time it was colder. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said. His voice was different now, almost as if it didn't belong to a human. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and a cold wind swept through the house. Maggie shivered, feeling the temperature drop. The man didn't seem to notice. He was still staring at the fire, his body perfectly still. I think you should leave now," Maggie said, trying to hide the fear in her voice. The man slowly stood up. His eyes had turned completely red, and he no longer looked like a normal person. Maggie took a step back, her heart racing. "I've come for something you have," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Before Maggie could ask what he meant, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, delicate Christmas ornament. It was a glass ball, decorated with tiny snowflakes and a flickering candle inside. Maggie gasped. "That's my grandmother's ornament," she cried. It was a family heirloom that had been passed down for generations. The man smiled again, this time showing sharp, pointed teeth. "I've waited a long time for this," he whispered. He held the ornament in his hand, and with a quick motion, it shattered into tiny pieces. The man's eyes glowed brighter, and the room seemed to twist around Maggie. She couldn't move, her feet glued to the floor. The man started to vanish, his body turning into smoke. Wait!" Maggie shouted, but it was too late. The man was gone, and the house was silent again. Maggie stood there, trembling, staring at the broken pieces of glass on the floor. The fire was still burning, but everything felt wrong. The next morning, Maggie's parents found her sitting in front of the fireplace, staring at the broken ornament. Her grandmother's ornament was gone, and there was no trace of the man who had visited. They never knew who the man was or why he came. But Maggie would always remember the strange visitor on Christmas Eve. She would never forget the dark figure with black eyes who came for her family's most precious Christmas gift. Story 5. Clara loved Christmas more than anything. Every year, she decorated her house with Christmas lights, set up the tree, and made sure everything was perfect. It was a tradition she had followed for as long as she could remember. This year, however, something felt different. It was Christmas Eve, and Clara had just finished putting the star on top of the tree. She stood back and admired her work. The tree was beautiful, with twinkling lights and sparkling ornaments. The living room smelled of pine and cinnamon, and outside, the snow was falling softly. But as Clara looked at the tree, she felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't the cold from outside, it was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then, she heard it, a soft whisper. Clara froze, trying to listen closely. The voice was so quiet she could barely hear it. It seemed to come from the direction of the tree, but when she looked, there was no one there. "Help me," the whisper said again. Clara felt her heart race. She was sure no one was in the room with her. But the whispering continued, as if calling her name. Suddenly, the lights on the tree flickered. The room grew colder, and Clara's breath became visible in the air. She walked cautiously toward the tree, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. And then, she saw her. A woman was standing by the tree, her back turned to Clara. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, the kind people used to wear a long time ago. Her hair was long and messy, and her skin was pale, almost ghostly. Clara stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The woman turned slowly, and Clara gasped. Her eyes were black, no white, just endless dark holes staring right at Clara. "Please," the woman whispered. "Help me." Clara couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, as if the woman's gaze was holding her in place. The temperature in the room dropped even more, and the lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at Clara, her black eyes filled with sadness. Then, slowly, the woman started to fade away. Clara blinked, and the woman was gone. The room returned to normal, and the cold air disappeared. Clara stood there for a moment, her heart still racing. Was it a dream? Had she imagined the whole thing? But when she looked at the tree, Clara saw something strange. On the branch closest to her, there was a small ornament she didn't recognize. It was old and cracked, with a tiny figure inside, and it was glowing softly. Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling. She reached out to touch the ornament, but as soon as her fingers brushed it, the glow faded. The figure inside seemed to disappear, leaving nothing but a cold emptiness. Clara backed away, realizing that the woman had left her a message. Some spirits aren't here to scare us, they just want to be remembered. That Christmas, Clara learned that the true spirit of Christmas is not just about celebration, but also about remembering those who have passed and the memories they left behind. Story 6. It was the first Christmas in their new house. Sarah and her family had just moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The house was beautiful, with wooden floors, big windows, and a fireplace that crackled on cold winter night. Despite its charm, there was something about the house that made Sarah feel uneasy. The air always felt a little too cold, even when the heat was on, and strange sounds seemed to echo through the rooms at night. But it was Christmas, and Sarah was determined to make the best of it. She decorated the tree with her parents, hanging ornaments and placing the star on top. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, and the warm glow of the lights on the tree made everything feel cozy. That night, after dinner, Sarah went to bed excited for Christmas morning. But just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a strange sound. It was coming from downstairs. At first, it sounded like a soft thud, then the sound of something scraping across the floor. Sarah's heart raced. It was late, and everyone was supposed to be asleep. She quietly got out of bed and crept toward the stairs. The house was dark except for the soft light from the Christmas tree in the living room. As she stepped down the stairs, the sounds grew louder. It was coming from the living room. When Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped in her tracks. There, in the middle of the room, was the Christmas tree shaking. The ornaments jingled as if an invisible force was moving them. The tree lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then, Sarah saw it. A figure, standing just in front of the tree. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with long, dark hair. Her face was pale, and her eyes were empty, black holes. Sarah gasped, but the figure didn't seem to notice her. The woman slowly reached out a hand, as if trying to touch the tree, but her fingers never made contact. Instead, the air around her shimmered, like she was not fully part of the world. The lights on the tree flickered again, and the figure's eyes turned toward Sarah. For a moment there was silence. Then, the woman whispered, "Help me." Sarah couldn't move. Fear gripped her chest, but she couldn't turn away. The woman's voice sounded sad, almost desperate. "Please, help me," she repeated. Before Sarah could say anything, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving only the cold air behind. The Christmas tree stopped shaking, and everything went still. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Was it a ghost? Was she dreaming? The next morning, Sarah told her parents what had happened, but they didn't believe her. They thought it was just her imagination. But when they went to check the tree, they found something strange. The tree's decorations had changed. Some of the ornaments were now broken, and a few of the lights had burned out. But what caught Sarah's attention was the old ornament hanging from one of the branches. It wasn't one she had put on the tree the night before. The ornament was an old, cracked glass ball with a tiny picture of a woman inside. It looked exactly like the woman she had seen the night before. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still there, watching them. That Christmas, she learned that some spirits remain tied to the places they once lived, and sometimes they can reach out to those who enter their homes. Story 7. It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve in the small town of Greendale. Snow blanketed the streets, and the soft glow of Christmas lights could be seen in every window. Families were busy preparing for the holiday, and the sound of carolers could be heard drifting through the air. Everyone was in high spirits, looking forward to a joyful Christmas morning. But for Emma, this Christmas was different. It was the first one she would spend without her grandmother, who had passed away earlier that year. Emma had always loved Christmas with her grandmother. Every year, they would decorate the tree together, bake cookies, and hang up the most beautiful Christmas lights. This year, Emma had decided to carry on the tradition by decorating her grandmother's house all on her own. The house was old, but full of warmth. It had a certain charm to it, especially at Christmas. The walls were adorned with vintage decorations, and the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air. Emma had put up a large tree in the living room, just like her grandmother used to, and hung strings of colorful lights all around the windows. It was late that night, and Emma was finishing the last of the decorations. She stepped back to admire her work, feeling a sense of accomplishment and a bit of sadness. The house looked beautiful, but it wasn't the same without her grandmother there to share it with. She sat down on the couch and sighed, looking out the window at the falling snow. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. Emma looked around, confused. The lights on the tree flickered as well, and for a split second, she thought she saw something moving in the reflection. She stood up, feeling uneasy. "Grandma," she whispered, half expecting to see her grandmother standing in the doorway, as if she had never left. But there was no one there. Emma shook her head, trying to push away the feeling. The lights flickered again, and this time, they went completely dark. Emma walked over to the window to check the lights outside, but when she pulled back the curtain, her heart stopped. There, on the front lawn, was the figure of a woman. She was standing still in the snow, her face hidden in shadow. She wore a long, flowing dress, and her hair was long and dark, blowing lightly in the winter wind. Emma couldn't make out her features, but there was something about her that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice shaky. But the woman didn't move. Emma felt an icy chill spread through the room, even though the house had been warm just moments ago. The temperature seemed to drop, and the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on her. Suddenly, the lights inside the house flickered back on, and Emma gasped. Standing in front of her, only a few feet away, was the same woman from the front yard. Her face was pale and cold, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through Emma. Her long, black hair hung loosely around her face, and her lips curled into a faint, sorrowful smile. Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and pointed toward the Christmas lights hanging on the wall. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the room. Then, as if responding to the woman's gesture, the lights began to glow brighter, the colors shifting to a deep red and green. Emma could hardly breathe. The woman took a step closer, her feet not even making a sound on the floor. "Help me," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with desperation. Emma backed away, shaking her head. "I don't know how to help you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The woman's hollow eyes seemed to widen. She reached toward Emma, her hands stretching unnaturally long. "Please, help me," she repeated, her voice more frantic this time. In a panic, Emma turned and ran toward the door, but as soon as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the house. She spun around to face the woman, but now she was standing directly in front of Emma, blocking her escape. "Why are you here?" Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. The woman's expression softened. She slowly lifted her hand, pointing toward the Christmas tree. Emma's eyes followed her finger, and to her horror, she saw the reflection of the woman in the tree's lights, but there was something more in the reflection. It was her grandmother, standing next to the woman, with a gentle smile on her face. "Grandma?" Emma whispered, her voice full of disbelief. The woman nodded, her face still pale and sad. "She's waiting for you," she said in a low, mournful voice. "But first, you must help me." Emma's heart raced, and she felt a sudden rush of emotion. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave her grandmother's side. The woman reached out one last time, her cold fingers brushing Emma's cheek. "You are not alone," she whispered, before slowly fading into the shadows. Emma stood in the room, breathing heavily, as the lights on the tree flickered and dimmed. She could still feel the cold presence, but when she turned around, the woman was gone. The next morning, Emma woke up to find the house completely still. The lights on the tree were no longer glowing, and the room felt warmer again. She checked the front lawn, but there was no sign of the woman. As Emma sat down by the tree, she noticed something strange. One of the ornaments had changed. It was an old, delicate glass ornament with a picture inside of a woman and a small child, both smiling happily. It looked just like her grandmother and her mother. Emma smiled softly. Perhaps the woman she had seen was her grandmother's spirit, wanting to let her know she was still with her. And on that Christmas night, Emma realized that even though she couldn't see her grandmother anymore, her love and memory would always be with her.